So welcome everyone to our Retrofit Meets event this evening on the topic of scalable solutions. I'm delighted to welcome you to this, and firstly want to thank you all for your patience with this particular event, as we have had to change the date once and then switch to the webinar format. So appreciate you sticking with us at the Building Centre as we've coordinated this event for you this evening. So I'm Laura Broderick. I work at the Building Centre and have been working on the Retrofit 23 programme, and delighted to say that this event is now happening, and it's actually our penultimate event for the whole season of Retrofit 23. The idea tonight is we have our panellists in the webinar format and a chair to lead us through that kind of panel discussion and the Q&A after their presentations. Delighted that you could join, and just really want to say that the idea tonight is that we enlighten and provoke some ideas around retrofit at scale and kind of talk about the challenges and present some of the solutions for a conversation with you as the webinar audience too. As we're in this online format, questions will be addressed through the chat function, which is the Q&A box that you will see at the bottom of your screen. Please don't, well, you can think of your questions as you go, but we won't be addressing them after each presentation. We'll be addressing them to our panel collectively at the end. But in order for tonight's proceedings to get going in full, we do have a chair helping us this evening. I'm delighted that Jonathan Hagos, Director of Freehouse Architecture, is here to chair the session. Jonathan is an architect. For those of you who don't know him, he's co-director of the Freehouse practice, which has built a reputation on designing sensitive design interventions, often in grade listed buildings and historic contexts. So it's great that Jonathan could give his time this evening to support the session. His experience is a bit more in the civic side of retrofits, but he obviously has a very general interest in retrofit as a whole and interest in how the residential situation is for the retrofit marketplace. So he has offered to chair the session. So I would love to say that Jonathan can contribute a little bit about his projects at another time, but for this evening he will just be hosting and making sure you know who our speakers are and that the Q&A flows successfully. But if you haven't been, Jonathan's practice, Freehouse, scooped an AJ Retrofit Award this year for their Africa Centre, and that's in Southwark. And if you haven't been to see that project, it's well worth a visit. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jonathan as the chair for this evening. Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you all.
Thank you, Laura, for that really, really kind introduction. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this really important conversation. As Laura's already said, my practice, Freehouse, is deeply interested in the conversation around retrofit. 100% of the work we do is in existing buildings, but these are mostly in community civic contexts, i.e. not housing. And so I'm really excited to chair this event. I think it's going to be really incredibly insightful, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A at the end. As Laura noted, we've got three exciting speakers from organisations looking at the challenges of residential retrofit and working out solutions based on housing stock, tenureship and community action. The speakers will showcase their work and ideas as we consider how we can achieve deep retrofit at scale, encouraging the audience, hopefully here today, to critically examine and discuss current practices and barriers in retrofitting our housing stock. Whilst also touching on how we can explore innovative approaches to technical resolution, potential collaborations that might simplify those processes as well, ultimately improving sustainability and creating local supply chain markets that kind of speak to a more environmental practice centered around retrofit. Today I'll be joined by three speakers. We've got Naomi Grint from Etude Sustainability Engineers, who will be talking about retrofitting at scale using archetypes. It's also featuring architects involved in that project too, including Levitt Bernstein. Phillipa Burgin of EarlKendrick, excuse me, who are an award-winning firm of chartered building surveyors. We'll talk about the challenges of leasehold retrofit. And lastly, Bridget Carey of Action on Empty Homes, which are community-based. She'll be leading a presentation titled Community-Based Retrofitting at Scale. Laura's already gone over the format of the evening, but just to remind you, we'll have 15 minutes for each presentation, and I'll quickly introduce each speaker beforehand. We'll then have a Q&A session. You'll have an opportunity to fire across questions to our guest speakers. There's a lot more to say, a lot more that could be introduced, but I'll just get going. I'll introduce our first speaker. I'll invite her to turn on her camera whilst I introduce her and say wonderful things. Naomi Grint is a building physics consultant and energy modeler at Etude. She has 20 years of experience working on environmental projects in various settings, including social housing providers, sustainability and retrofit consultants, and sustainable architecture practice. She's also a Passive House and Enefit certifier at Etude. Coincidentally, Naomi and I studied architecture together around 20 years ago or so. So it's great to see her here and to find out more about her approaches to practice. So I'll hand you over to Naomi. Thank you.
Thanks, John. It's brilliant to be here. Share my screen. So tonight I'm going to be discussing a retrofit process for housing stock that we've been developing, and we've been collaborating with a few different organisations, primarily Levitt, Bernstein and Raft. And tonight we're going to be talking about a project that we worked on for Southern Housing, which was about decarbonisation of their housing stock. And we used the principle of archetypes to help simplify this. And we'll also talk about the process we use generally for a similar kind of work. So not to dwell on the depressing bit for too long, but we are in a bit of a hurry to get to net zero carbon. There's often a bit of a focus on what's going to happen by 2050, but we also have a carbon budget to work within, and there's different routes to get to net to 2050. If we keep going the way we're going, we're going to use up our carbon budget very quickly. If we wait a bit and then decarbonise quickly, then that makes the life very stressful. If we get on with it, then we can make the journey a lot more pleasant. We can learn more. We can help industries develop and avoid a lot of shock along the way. So yeah, just briefly on the key principles of net zero carbon. So it's a relatively simple concept. So the operational energy is balanced by generating renewable energy, or ideally going even further and going beyond net zero on individual building level, because remembering that not every building can get there, so we need to go further where we can. So on the balance on the left hand side, we've got reducing heat loss. Basic measures are insulating the building, wrapping on the outside if you can, or insulating inside with caution. Excellent window replacements that are well installed, and air tightness at the junctions, and continuous ventilation with heat recovery. So coupled with that, we need to have low carbon efficient heat supplied. The only way to do that is by ending our gas heating that we have at the moment. And so removing gas from the heating strategy as early as possible does have a profound impact on carbon emissions in a project. And we need to do this as soon as possible. It's not always obvious how to do that. So as part of this work, we developed a decision tree. So you look at where you start now at the top and where you want to get to at the bottom. Ideally, we'd like individual heat pumps for each dwelling, because they're the most efficient way to go. But failing that, ambient loop system if it's communal heating, or direct electric if you've managed to achieve very low heating demand. On the other side of the balance, we've got renewable energy. So as much PV wherever you can, as much as you can, and high efficiency panels. So here's some examples of ways it can be done sensitively in a retrofit context. So our process is there's a few different steps, and different organisations like to focus on different parts of the process. So from the top to the bottom, we've got the strategic part. We're understanding the needs of each organisation, looking at where they want to focus their energy, looking at their residents, if there's any particular demographics, if there's a particular high fuel poverty percentage or anything like that. We're thinking about the types of metrics that are particularly significant to that organisation. And then really looking at the stock in a lot of detail, looking at the data, going to site, and from that coming up with some archetypes that help simplify the stock into groups that need similar measures. And then the idea is that those have different trajectories towards net zero carbon, which is the little graphs along the bottom. Then the next bit is the more detailed part. So we can look at, we're digging into more detail and thinking about solutions. We can model measures per archetype and then as a building stock. So we can look at how to get the organisation all the way to net zero as close as possible over a number of steps. And then in some projects, we've got into actually doing quite detailed work for indicative designs for each archetype. So the bottom line is whole house planning and sequencing. Obviously, we want to know how it all fits together, and we want to think of the end goal, and then the stages on that journey should not compromise that end goal. So we don't want to have sort of dead end measures where we're putting in something that doesn't allow for another measure further down the line. So the risks and interdependencies, it's thinking about, is there any moisture risk? Is there enough ventilation if you're making the building airtight? Have you ventilated the loft? Those sorts of things. And then comes the pilot projects, which is where we do the real learning. So that's some examples of internal wall insulation, top left, and then an MVHR unit in a small flat. So it can work in small spaces. PV installation in quite a tight space. Some nice picture of some rotting joists, which is not a nice thing to find, but we need to know about them. And then some ducts for ventilation system, a nice bit of air tightness taping on a joist, and a heat pump and tank installation. So once we've done the pilot projects, it becomes a cycler process, so we can learn more about each archetype. We can go back into the details. We can think about the whole house planning. Is it all working? Do there need to be any adjustments? So it's this iterative framework, and at the end, it all gets a lot better, cheaper. We have a greater understanding of what we're doing. We get to net zero carbon more efficiently. Alongside this, thinking about how we actually present the work to the organisations we work for, it's about getting the information across clearly and showing what needs to be done and the different steps along the way in a digestible way to lots of different types of audience. So I think that's really important when we think about retrofit. Just a few examples of different projects at different stages. So this is the Retrofit London Housing Action Plan, which was a strategic piece of work for 33 London councils. And it was a guide for local authorities on how to get their homes retrofitted in each area. And it involved some high-level analysis of London stock and began to identify archetypes and talk about how local authorities might map out building a journey towards net zero for each archetype. There's another piece of work we did, City of London, where we did a lot of site analysis and data gathering again, and including talking to residents and getting survey results from residents as well. We split the housing stock into 6 archetypes, depending on different complexities of their facades, and they've got quite a particular housing stock. We did a stock model, a simplified stock model, which showed how they could get their stock to net zero carbon or close to net zero carbon over 20 years it was at the time. We are doing some more work with them and hoping to help them realise this as well. So Southern Housing Group, we did a lot of similar work from the other 2 examples on the understanding needs and identification of archetypes. I think what was really special about this one was the detail that went into the scenario planning for the different archetypes, and yeah, there was also a lot of consideration what measures would need to go hand in hand and what to avoid. So on the site visits and stock analysis side, there was sort of, again, this iterative process between going to site, looking at the data, trying to break down it was quite a lot of homes. It's over 20,000, I think. So it's not the sort of data you can skim through and know it line by line. We had to make a lot of assumptions by searching different properties. So there was a lot of testing out of ideas and then going back to the building stock to see if that actually made sense in reality. And yeah, so in the end we got to 7 archetypes that were really useful in helping us to helping us to work out what was needed for the plan. So just a few examples of some of the details that came out of this, thanks to Raft and Levitt Bernstein. I can't take credit for these. So we came up with appropriate targets for each archetype because some are easier to retrofit than others. And then we looked at whole house detailing and then detailing of specific parts of each archetype, and ideas for how to take that through into a building plan for individual buildings. So in summary about what we've learned and how to move forward, I think it's really important to get a full picture of what organisations need, making sure the data is fully understood and comprehensible, and visiting the buildings, and for organisations themselves to monitor as much as they can and just keep that knowledge in a sort of meaningful way. And then getting the order right, so starting with the easy measures, but obviously not making sure that you do everything well the first time and you're not stopping the path to net zero later on. There's some interesting debate on the fabric first methodology versus fabric plus heat. So some buildings need a lot of fabric retrofit measures in order to enable low carbon heat. Some of them you don't have to do much before you can put in a heat pump. So there's a lot of intricate conversation around those. And then retrofit prioritizing, so thinking about for individual organizations, any trigger points in their maintenance programs, any opportunities that if a state needs a significant renewal, then we know that's a good place to start. Thinking about getting ready for funding, getting all your ducks in a row, so when funding opportunities come along, they're ready to fly, and thinking about synergy with maintenance, and generally just keeping an eye on the end goal and not getting too overwhelmed and just doing the next right thing that comes along. I needed to get a Frozen reference in there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Naomi. That was really insightful. Thanks so much. I mean, particularly, I think some of the simplicity of those graphics and in particular the decision tree I found really helpful, just to kind of how you might take a residential homeowner or even a developer through those kind of strategic decisions that you need to have against each archetype. I'm sure we'll have some questions at the end on that. So yeah, to the audience, if you have any questions for Naomi, please start jotting them down, and obviously in the Q&A we'll do our best to go through them as much as we can, as best as we can. Thank you, Naomi. I'm going to invite you to turn off your screen and you can join us again at the Q&A. Our second speaker today is Phillipa Burgin. She is a senior building surveyor and associate director of EK Retrofit. Her professional surveying experience spans both the residential and commercial sectors, giving her a broad knowledge across the built environment. Phillipa's passion lies in improving the thermal performance of existing buildings through retrofit, and more recently, since leading EK Retrofit, has been advising homeowners, landlords and leaseholders on how they can achieve minimum EP standards. So I'm going to invite her to turn on her screen and share her presentation with us. Thank you, Phillipa.
Hello, thank you, Jonathan. All right, let's see if I can get the right screen here. Can everyone see that okay?
That's perfect, Phillipa.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Naomi. That was really interesting. My name's Phillipa Burgin. I'm a chartered building surveyor. And as Jonathan said, I'm heading up EK Retrofit. Really honoured to be a part of this panel this evening, so thank you for having me. EK Retrofit is a team specialising in retrofit within the EarlKendrick building surveyors. We're actually based in the building centre, which is where we were all supposed to be meeting tonight until the tube and train strikes foiled our plans for the second time as well. But nevertheless, here we are this evening, and I'm going to be speaking about challenges specifically within leasehold retrofit. So, EarlKendrick Building Surveyors, who are we? What do we do? Fundamentally, we are a firm of chartered building surveyors, and we offer quite a wide variety of services, as you can see on the screen there. I don't think they're all even listed on there, but we've got the key ones. And EK Retrofit, as I've mentioned, was formed to specialise in retrofit, and was established about a year ago, maybe a little bit more. And particularly with a focus on retrofit within a leasehold environment, i.e. blocks of flats in large, whether it be mansion blocks or purpose-built blocks in the London area and nationwide, really. That's where our existing client base is, which are typically sort of property or estate managers or RTMs of large leasehold blocks. Typically, the buildings that we're working in are of traditional construction. They're often either in a conservation area, they might be listed or have heritage importance of some kind, which makes it fun and challenging for us. But yeah, generally, as building surveyors, we are well versed in identifying building defects, in pulling together 10-year plan maintenance programs for our clients, and designing and managing major refurbishment works of existing buildings. So it's been a natural progression, really, to offer a dedicated service line in retrofit, as we identified a bit of a gap in our advice, but also a gap in the industry really as a whole. So we really aim to try and be ahead of that curve. So why now? Why did we establish EK Retrofit? You are all attending a webinar on retrofit on a Wednesday evening of your own accord. And as Naomi says, I don't want to dwell on the sort of depressing side of things. I don't think I need to spend too long talking about the drivers behind retrofit and why it's important. But the key ones are on the screen there. Obviously, a couple of weeks back, just on the minimum energy efficiency standards, Rishi's big green rollback caused a bit of a media uproar, which basically pushed back a number of measures, including the banning of petrol and diesel cars, the banning of gas boilers, and also, key for us, the projected increase in minimum EPC rating of C. Like I said, that caused a little bit of a media uproar, but ultimately, as far as we're concerned, we don't see too much to have changed. We are still committed by law under the Climate Change Act to be net zero by 2050. So all of our buildings need to be SAP rating or an EPC rating of A by that point. And of course, at 2050, the vast majority of the residential homes that we're going to be living in are already here today. They already exist. Only about 20% of the homes that we live in at that point are going to be new build or built between now and then. So yes, it's obviously very important that they are built to a high standard and they perform well thermally, but you know, the rest of that, the remaining 80% that are already here, they need our attention, and they need it, you know, fairly urgently. So retrofit works aim to improve a building's energy performance, its ventilation, or its carbon dioxide emissions. These are the typical retrofit measures that we advise our clients on. window upgrades, so double or triple glazing or secondary glazing, which is often an option if the property is listed or in a conservation area. Planners unfortunately don't look kindly on ripping out windows and replacing them, but secondary glazing can be a good option when installed and designed and installed well. Photovoltaic panels, wall insulation, whether that's external, cavity, or internal. Solar shading, this is often overlooked when talking about retrofitting. Solar shading sort of aims at addressing overheating, and with sort of temperatures on the rise as they are, and with the new builds often being built to you know, very airtight and loads of insulation, which is great, but actually that can result in overheating sometimes. So that's when we would look to introduce solar shading. Replacing heating systems with low carbon systems. So we're often doing heat pump feasibility surveys, trying to replace gas systems with more sustainable systems. And then easy wins such as draft proofing and installing energy efficient lighting, which can be cheap and easily done and very effective. When retrofitting a single dwelling, the best practice approach is generally to take what's called a whole house approach. I'm going to speak about it a little bit later, and Naomi touched on it as well. But this is essentially where, following a detailed condition survey, a retrofit assessment can be made, and any of the measures on the screen or more might be considered, designed and installed accordingly. But when retrofitting a flat that sits within a leasehold block, it's not always as straightforward to do that. And some of the measures on the screen may well be prohibited under a leaseholder's lease. For example, if you sort of envisage a normal leasehold plan, which has a red line along the leaseholder's demise, it generally follows the internal finishes of a flat. It generally cuts out all structural works or structure, sorry, and it also usually omits windows. So it's not easy for a leaseholder, for example, a lot of the time, to just replace their windows, because actually the windows don't belong to them or fall under their liability. Similarly, there are some retrofit works that are just not practicable or feasible for a single leaseholder in a flat to undertake. And the most obvious example of that is insulation, external insulation or cavity wall insulation. It's just not possible to install that, either of those measures, to a flat alone. It needs to be carried out to the whole building. So yeah, I touched on it just then. Fabric first approach, essentially, as a concept, it's not always applicable, but generally we encourage owners, leaseholders, anyone looking to undertake retrofit works, not to rush towards changes in services. So there has been a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction to heat pumps, for example, which can work fantastically, but as we found on some of our feasibility studies, if the building itself or its thermal elements, i.e. its walls, its windows, its roof, are leaky, they're leaking heat, then that really needs to be addressed first and foremost, before rushing towards those potentially expensive service upgrades. And yeah, whole house, I already touched on that as well. It's that the importance of really looking at the building as a whole. A few years back, there was a rush towards installing cavity wall insulation or external wall insulation as a sort of magical fix, without a real understanding that whenever you introduce any level of insulation to a building, even if it's upgrading to double glazing, that is going to have a knock-on effect to the risk of condensation within that building, and that needs to be mitigated, usually through equal improvements to its ventilation. So yeah, and overlooking that can result in real sort of insidious problems in the building, and interstitial condensation. It might be forming inside the walls, inside the cavities, affecting timber, rotting it away out of sight for years, and you might not know until it's essentially too late, and it's very, very difficult to reverse the effects of undertaking such measures without looking at the whole house. So, common challenges that we've sort of identified through working in the retrofit space, specifically within blocks of flats. I'm going to talk about liability, I'm going to talk about improvement versus repair, and I'm going to talk about the Section 20 and competitive tender processes. So, liability. Who is responsible for retrofitting in a leaseholder block? Your typical leaseholder might be stuck living in a flat that's drafty, it's uninsulated, it's leaking heat, their bills have skyrocketed, particularly over the last 2-3 years. You know, there isn't anyone really who hasn't felt that. And ultimately, this leaseholder might not be enjoying thermal comfort within their home. All of these things impact the leaseholder's pocket, but they also impact the leaseholder's health. And it can be quite exasperating for that leaseholder if they feel like they can't change it or do anything about it, because they feel like it's out of their hands. But there's this sort of clash of incentives. So the leaseholder has a clear incentive because they're the bill payer, and they're the person also who lives there and is experiencing any discomfort. But the landlord might not have such an incentive at this stage. You know, they might think, well, why should I pay X amount of money when I don't really receive much benefit of it? But we are seeing more and more the value of these buildings is slowly being affected by matters such as this. And that is predicted to increase over the next however many years. So people looking to buy a property now are more and more interested in a way that they might not have been previously as to how that property performs thermally, because if they have 2 properties in a similar price bracket and one is, you know, a D rating or lower on its EPC and the other is higher, they're more than likely to go with the one that's higher, not only because it's likely to be a more comfort for them to live in. If they choose to rent it out, they need to be thinking about its performance, but also in terms of bills, it's going to cost them less. That the more efficient property will cost them less in the long run. So there's a bit of a lag, I think, on the landlord's incentive to carry out such works, or the freeholder's incentive, but it is going to catch up, and that is going to come to fruition, I think. So back to the sort of liability then. Who is liable? We aren't property solicitors, and every single lease is different. So every leasehold retrofit project does need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. And of course, if the lease isn't clear, which, let's face it, what lease is clear? It's very rare, or I mean, I've certainly never seen a lease that's written in plain layman's terms. Then the best thing to do is to get a property solicitor involved, to unpick the nuances around the liability and what can and can't be carried out, and by whom. But generally speaking, it can be quite difficult for the landlord or the freeholder, i.e. the owner of the block or building, to undertake retrofit works via the major works process, i.e. the major works process, for those who don't know, this is when funds are collected from the leaseholders to pay for works required to the building. Most leases prohibit improvements to be made via this process, and will only allow works that are repair or maintenance in nature to be carried out under this process. So really, this is likely to rule out a lot of retrofit works, as at the end of the day, retrofit works are aimed at undertaking improvements to the building's performance, whether it's thermal performance or its ventilation performance or the way that its services are performing. So it can be difficult, and we have seen freeholders get in hot water even for installing double glazing when the building originally had single glazing. They can be put in a tricky situation legally in some cases, so it needs to be clarified. So another challenge is the Section 20 process, which requires a competitive tender to be carried out. Through Section 20, which is under the Landlord and Tenant Act, a competitive tender for such works needs to be carried out formally. Various matching tenders need to be produced from various different contractors, which is all well and good, and it's a good way of undertaking works on the whole. I mean, we do it day in, day out on buildings, but the risk I find with competitive tenders is that it often results in a bit of a race to the bottom. So contractors will throw in quite a low price just because they want to win the job, and then they will figure out, as they, if they get the job, they will then figure out how they're going to make it work their side to deliver what they've said they're going to deliver, but still make a comfortable profit. Which, again, it's all well and good. This is a part of the industry. However, when it comes to retrofit works, it doesn't really, it's not best suited for retrofit works. The importance on the design and the installation is massive. Touched on it earlier, but it can go very wrong if corners are cut. So yeah, the emphasis really is on getting that design right and getting a competent installer and having all the checks made throughout the construction process. And yeah, just not cutting corners is essential with any works, but particularly with retrofit works. So what retrofit works can a leaseholder undertake? Well, they can still do quite a lot. Obviously, I've mentioned that windows and external insulation can be tricky in some of these sort of whole building measures, but there is a lot that a leaseholder can do. And I've listed some of them on the screen there. So they can look at internal wall insulation to their external walls, installing secondary glazing, installing thermal radiator valves, TRVs, which essentially provide control over the heat in their rooms, upgrading their light bulbs, changing their behaviour. This again is something that's often overlooked, but even being aware of the off-peak electricity rates, if that's possible in their situation, and changing their behaviour accordingly. Installing pipework lagging and radiator reflector pads to minimise heat loss. Installing draft proofing, windows and doors. Draft proofing can make a huge difference. And of course, installing a smart meter. Ultimately, it is better that the leaseholder undertakes such works when already refurbishing their apartment. From a timing perspective, it's better. It means that they can undertake all of them at once if that's financially viable for them. And ideally, they would have a license to alter agreed with their freeholder, with their landlord. just to ensure that all retrofit measures that are being carried out are being carried out, designed, installed by someone who is competent, and then all that work that is carried out can be recorded as well and kept with the building. Any whole building retrofit measures that can be carried out by the freeholder or by the landlord, where the lease does prohibit it. Just a note on timing and phasing. We always encourage property managers and freeholders to try and link this in with major works of the building. So if there is going to be a scaffold on the building in, you know, year 2 of your planned maintenance plan, then why not undertake retrofit works at that point? Anyone on the call who has paid for scaffolding or has you know, worked in a project where they can see how much scaffolding costs, it is not cheap, and it's often one of the biggest, if not the biggest cost in big refurbishment projects. So in order to get the most value out of that cost, it makes sense to carry out as many works as possible from the scaffold. So it just involves a bit of thought and planning, and to think, well, there's not going to be a scaffold on this building for another 10 years. The minimum energy efficiency standards are ever tightening. Yes, they've just been pushed back, but not for 10 years. They are going to come get tighter within a 10-year period. So you don't want to be in a situation later down the line where you're going to have to put a scaffold up solely to address you know, to undertake a retrofit measure to get you in compliance with MEES. Why not do it now while the scaffold's up, and then you know you're covered? So yeah, phasing and timing and yeah, pre-planning is key. So I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, to be honest, but I have a couple.
A few more minutes, Phillipa, so if you could come through those last slides, that would be great.
Okay, fine. Just a couple of quick case studies then that we've worked on. Troy Court, this is a prominent block of flats on Kensington High Street, conservation area. We initially were instructed to undertake a heat pump feasibility study. We found that heat pumps, despite having a lovely large flat roof and all the space in the world, were not going to be financially viable for the client. They were actually going to cost the client more because their consumption was so high. And through our thermal imaging survey, we could see that none of the elevations are leaking heat in areas, and those areas are around all of the heating pipe work and the radiators. And this is the good thing about the thermal imaging surveys. It's very, very visual. You can see there the one flat that has not yet upgraded its windows at the bottom there. That's single glazing, and it's just pouring out the heat. And yeah, the lines there and the white spots, that's the pipe work for the heating systems and the radiators, which after a bit of intrusive investigation we found was none of it was lagged or insulated at all. So actually we advised that this needs to be addressed first, and that's actually a relatively easy win for them, with the aim of getting that consumption down, and then they can maybe revisit heat pumps once they've addressed these issues in the fabric. Just quickly then, another quick case study. This was a block of about 70 flats in Bethnal Green. All 70 flats were rated between an EPC rating of D or below, and a lot of the flats were being rented out. So they were either, well, they weren't yet in breach of MEES, but they were heading that way. We started on this one looking into external wall insulation and doing the feasibility and costings for that. But again, through the thermal imaging survey, we were able to identify that actually the windows which were not actually that old. They were about 8 or 9 years old, and they were double glazed, but they didn't have any thermal breaks in frames and the mullions and the sort of frame that goes around the glazing. So they were just pouring out heat. So we then started to look at replacement, but also as a leaseholder measure, we've been looking at thermal paint that can be applied on the internal surfaces of the windows that has a thermal or insulative quality to it. There's no need for an expensive scaffold, and a leaseholder can do this, very, very easily and relatively cheaply and to a good impact. And we're hoping to carry this out and actually go back with the thermal camera and see how well that's performed. So that's something to look forward to. So yeah, just very quickly, key takeaways from today: whole house approach and fabric first, very important. Look out for the easy wins. Retrofit works do not always have to be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. There are small changes that can be made that can make a really big difference. Understand MEES. We didn't talk too much about the minimum energy efficiency standards today, but for anyone that rents out their flat, it's essential where you sit within those. They are only going to get tighter and tighter as we approach 2050. And yeah, timing is everything. Think, proper planning, and make the most of having workers on site or having works done within a flat, to capitalize on the sort of cost of preliminaries. And yeah, that's it for me. Thank you very much. I know we're not doing questions now, but questions later or at the end, whenever. Pass you back over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Philippa. We've already had some questions coming through for you, so I'm sure we'll cover those off in the Q&A. Yeah, really interesting presentation. Lots I'm keen to discuss further. The recent scaling down in government targets and deadlines in relation to the climate emergency, the tensions in leaseholder and freeholder responsibilities, I think is really super important, and also retrofit in heritage context. So hopefully we'll cover those off in the Q&A. As I said, do keep on to the audience. Keep your questions coming in. We're not going to answer them live in the chat, but we're going to obviously go through those in the Q&A at the end of the presentations. So Philippa, I'll invite you to turn off your screen and stop sharing your screen if possible. And I will do a quick pithy introduction to Bridget, who is our final presenter today. Bridget Carey is a consultancy and project manager for Action on Empty Homes. Bridget joined Action on Empty Homes in May 2016 as a project manager to deliver a study focused on bringing empty homes into use through community-based approaches. Bridget has developed a community action on empty homes toolkit as a resource for local authorities and community groups, and she's currently leading a new project, a feasibility study to test and evaluate local community-led retrofit empty homes action partnerships. So I'll invite Bridget to share her screen and turn on her camera and talk you through her presentation. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Thank you. Great to be here. It's turning into a very, very interesting evening. I'm just going to try and sort out the technology. There we go. Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I'm Bridget Carey. I work for Action on Empty Homes. We're a small campaigning charity, fundamentally. We've got some primary aims, really, to raise awareness of the waste of long-term empty homes, and we campaign for changes in national policy. But we also work alongside communities who live alongside empty homes and experience the negative impacts, if you like, of empty homes. And we work with them around them bringing those empty homes into use as affordable housing for members of their own communities. We publish our research, it's all on our website. And we're also doing quite a bit of work at the moment around wealth investment and under occupation of homes, second homes, for example, Airbnb, as well as homes that are truly empty all the time. So just to give you a few stats, in England, these stats refer to England. In England, there's over 248,000 long-term empty homes at the moment. That's up 11%, sorry, 11,000 or 5% this year. There's a further, and this is based on local authority council tax data. So there's a further at least 200,000 empty properties which are exempt from council tax, but still stand empty and unoccupied. The long-term empty properties are those that are empty for more than 6 months. There's another almost 230,000 that are short-term empty, so that's less than 6 months. So just based on the clear data that we have access to, there's that 676,000 homes in England at the moment, when we have a housing crisis and over 300,000 households are homeless and in some sort of temporary accommodation. There's the data has lots of issues with it. There's, you know, local authorities counting consistently. They rely also quite heavily in some areas on self-reporting. And the general view, if you like, of sort of how many in practice homes there are standing empty in England is over 1 million. So it's a scandal, really. Just to give you an idea of where those empty homes are, there's the map on the left. The darker the area, obviously, the more the empty homes. So you can see there's some concentrations in the northwest, the northeast, southwest, and then smatterings around the rest of England. But it's interesting to overlay those maps, that map, with a map of where fuel poverty is in the UK and where the worst experience of fuel poverty are. And they are remarkably consistent, if you like, where you have many areas of empty homes. You also have poor housing conditions of those homes that are occupied. And had we taken a COVID map, which we did during the pandemic, you can again overlay health risk maps, and they come up with pretty similar areas are showing as priorities at the same time. And of course, when we talk about fuel poverty, that is not just to do with being able to heat and cool your home. It's also about being able to cook food. It's about the impact that living in a cold home that you can't afford to heat has all this sort of mental health impacts as well. So when we approach empty homes, yes, we're interested in the empty homes and getting them back into use, but we're also very concerned about the social impact of homes standing empty when we really need to improve and increase the housing stock for people. Sorry, there we go. So as Jonathan said, in 2019, we produced a toolkit, Community Action Empty Homes Toolkit, really for local authorities and communities and other partners to look at, okay, you know, if a community wants to bring empty homes in its area into use, how do you go about that? What partnerships do you need in place? And I was coming to the end of writing it, and that had that sort of horrible sinking feeling that, hang on a minute, we haven't included retrofit in this. Which was, you know, as soon as I realised it was clearly a major omission, given we were in 2019. So we asked the question, really, you know, we know that communities already are able to renovate and reuse long-term empty homes. They provide affordable housing for people within their own communities, but they also, in that process of renovation, they provide on-site training and skills development, particularly for people who struggle to access the employment framework. and they help to regenerate the local economy. They also, most of them that we've worked with, have sort of spin-off benefits as well. For example, they might have bakeries and cafes, community owned, bicycle repair shops, workspace, training space, that sort of thing. So they add a huge amount of value to the community, in addition to the accommodation that they provide. So we thought, well, what happens if we ask the question, well, why not renovate while retrofitting? Communities are concerned about climate change, they're concerned about fuel poverty. So it would seem to make sense to try and build in retrofit. We hit upon an immediate challenge, which is the lack of local infrastructure to actually carry out retrofitting. A lot of the government programmes have fallen on their faces, really, because they're top down. And if you or I wanted to have our home fully retrofitted tomorrow, we would probably struggle with skills, supply chain, information, understanding. And this issue of the sort of policy approach, if you like, to retrofitting consistently misses out the same communities, and those are the communities that are most in need and living with the worst type of housing and environments. So having worked in partnership previously and promoted partnership working at the local level, we thought, well, how's about we try building local retrofit empty homes action partnerships to pull together the various fingers that you need in the pie to be able to carry out a programme of retrofitting, rather than the kind of opportunistic one-off client that's knowledgeable and wants to do it sort of retrofitting approach, and do it on a community-wide level. So we thought we would explore that, and in the process aim to develop a framework showing which bits of the jigsaw needed to be in place for a successful community retrofit programme that could then be scaled up. And from that as well, we aim to lobby government funding to be provided via local authorities and directly to communities, rather than down through the likes of E.ON. So we've just completed a 1-year feasibility study in 4 local areas to see whether the idea works, whether it's possible. And we were funded by Esme Fairbairn Foundation to carry out this work. We worked in 4 areas. There's a map there to show you that we were basically north of the M62, Lancashire and Yorkshire. We worked with Preston, Rochdale, Skipton, which at that time was in Craven District Council, but it's now part of the new unitary North Yorkshire Council, and in Leeds. Each area was very different set of circumstances, which is what you'd expect working with communities. Things they had in common was that they all had a strategic and political buy-in from the local authority, which was essential, really. But interestingly, that wasn't around housing. It was around climate change and regeneration of local economies. They also all had colleges providing construction skills training, which was really important for us, because we want to provide we want the community groups to provide the on-site training in green skills. Rochdale and Leeds already have existing community-based housing projects. Preston and Skipton, Craven don't at the moment, but there's a lot of community activity in those areas around renewable energy, but not around housing as such. So what did we do? Well, I call it stalking with consent. Basically, we observe, we're there on site, asking questions, talking, learning. I should point out that none of us from Action Empty Homes are experts in this field. So this was a journey of discovery for us, as well as for some of the communities that we were working with. Importantly as well, we explored people's aspirations. So, I mean, A couple of people have already said, you know, it's easy to focus on doom and gloom, but we thought let's look what people want to aim for. What do people want to achieve from this kind of exercise? We did a lot of ferreting out of potential partners. Who did we need around the table, if you like, to make this work? And once we'd identified those partners, we put them in touch with each other, both within each geographical area, but also across the geographical areas. So, for example, a social enterprise in Rochdale, we were able to connect them with an emerging workers co-op in Preston and share knowledge and experience. We met with a whole host of national, regional bodies, local bodies. We looked at materials and supply chain issues, identifying, you know, why were some projects using non-sustainable insulation materials, for example, whereas others were using wood fibre. What was the decision making around that? The interpretation of risk as far as finance is concerned was a really interesting area that we looked at. And we scoped out both private and public sector finance options. Lots of discussion about training and skills, because if we're going to get that local infrastructure, we need the skills in the area. There's also, again, as the other two colleagues have already said, we need to know what an effective retrofit looks like, because, you know, certainly while we've been looking at this area, we've come across quite a bit of retrofit work that was brave and quite pioneering at the time, but hasn't stood the test of time. And underpinning all of this, and in all of our discussions with professionals, with non-professionals, the underpinning focus of this is on developing social enterprise to deliver retrofit at the local level, and communities being at the heart of that change from to a more sustainable economy. Okay, nice little happy slides, I suppose. This is Canopy Housing trainees working to retrofit an empty home in Leeds, and they do all the work. So you know, there's a couple of things that they get specialist contractors in to do, but the trainees learn on the job, they're trained on the job, and they have and by doing so, it means that they really understand what they're doing and the purpose of what they're doing, and the decision making that goes into, you know, why have we put this piece of insulation here, why have we done this over here. Just quickly, we were looking at building a framework, which is I'll speak about in a minute, but we did have some quite interesting insights on the way. We arrived at retrofit with the kind of rhetoric that it is often spoken about, which is it's so expensive, this is going to be really, really expensive to retrofit, and clearly it's going to have a cost. But what we found when we looked at particularly government figures and figures that were being used, if you like, to say how much money would be needed, how much funding would be needed, mixed together the renovation cost with the retrofit cost. But what we found was that once you've assessed the retrofitting work that you're going to do and you have your plan in place, those costs actually remain fairly stable. What varies is the renovation cost if you find dry rot, or, you know, you find there's a structural flaw in the property. Those costs can vary quite considerably, but the retrofitting we found was a fairly reliable cost if it had been properly assessed in the first place. We also tried to work out, well, where do you need new special expertise, and where can you just adapt existing knowledge? And we found that the way you need the really specialist technical expertise is at the beginning, when you do the initial assessment of the property, at the end, when you do the evaluation of, you know, is this what we were expecting, and is it functioning as it should, and the bit in between, which is the project management, dealing with all the sort of troubleshooting and whatever. Trades and installation bodies need to adapt, but really there's no need to completely retrain the workforce. It's an adaptation process. We also, when we did the budget for the feasibility study, we set out quite a bit of money really for doing awareness raising with communities. We found we didn't have to. The communities in the 4 areas that we worked with were up for it. You know, straight away they were on board. We didn't have to convince people that this was a good idea. And I think that's because we were speaking directly to people who are on the sharp end, if you like, of failure to retrofit and to make meaningful interventions around fuel poverty. There's also a strategic question, which, you know, I don't know the answer to at the moment, but is it better to do, I mean, communities retrofitting is a neighbourhood-based approach. But should it be, for example, in Rochdale, they do whole streets of terraced houses with external wall insulation. In Leeds, it's more of an individual property approach. But, you know, should it be neighbourhood? Should it be pepper potting? Should it be whole streets? Should it be individual houses? So these are the kind of questions that we're left with and still exploring. But the whole, as I said, the whole basis of this is that it's based on community-focused leadership, which is absolutely fundamental and empowering. And that's the thing that really changes the feel of retrofitting and makes it more deliverable. So just almost finally, I don't know whether you can see the whole screen, the whole slide, but basically we came up with, we identified core elements that need to be in place around communities and their partnerships. And those are communities and their partnerships. There's the access to empty homes. There's, you know, you need people around who are able to do the technical assessment. There needs to be the training on site. The supply chain needs work, and that means engaging with local suppliers, contractors, and so on. And really importantly, you need the quality control and the monitoring at the end of it. But all of this has at its very heart the community and the community's partnerships. So that is the framework that we have applied for some further funding to deliver. Now that we've pulled the framework together, we want to deliver it in the areas where we've been working initially, and write that up, if you like, perhaps as a toolkit, perhaps as a sort of as a report, but a practical report. We've published the results of our feasibility study, which are on our website. We're continuing to look at private public finance opportunities, and we're working with a number of colleagues who are working with the Green Finance Institute and so on. We're sharing our findings and receiving a lot of interest, much more interest than I thought we would actually when we started this, but it's clearly hit the spot somewhere. And we're lobbying politicians and policymakers around shifting the funding focus through the local authority and or directly to communities. So as I said, we're still waiting to hear whether we're going to receive 3 more years of funding to continue to deliver this project. But, you know, by all means, get in touch with us, keep in touch with us, you know, through the various means that are there, and please do download our report from the website. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. That was, yeah, again, really interesting. Some initially really sobering facts there, in particular about the alignments between empty homes in our country and fuel poverty. But incredible to see such purposeful action in the way in which you work, and also the creation of social value, which aligns a lot with how we like to practice as well in our existing contexts and communities. It's now time for our Q&A. We've already had lots and lots of questions, which is really exciting. We'll have around 15 to 20 minutes. I'm going to invite our speakers to all turn on their cameras. And for those tuning in, you can use our chat function. And what I will do is try and share the questions as best as I can. I had prepared a few questions of my own, just on the off chance that we weren't going to have as many questions as we do. But I think in my role as chair, I think I'll still take the opportunity to ask one question before I go on to relay the ones that have been put into the chat. Just to say thank you again to Naomi, Bridget, and Phillipa. Again, really, really super interesting. As I said at the top of the event, I'm really interested in retrofit, and similarly as in the way in which you work, we work with communities, charities, and in many instances, budgets are very, very lean. VAT for us puts a lot of pressure on our clients in the ways in which they work, and within a civic sphere, we try and explore VAT exemption opportunities in terms of how we design, whether it's annexes or how we adapt existing buildings. Within a housing context, obviously, new build housing is zero rated. I just wondered if you might touch on, maybe not necessarily purely VAT, but some of the policies that are kind of really impacting the way in which each of you practice, and maybe creates tensions in the way in which you can deliver meaningful retrofit. Particularly, I was thinking, Bridget, maybe as a starting point, just working in empty homes, which obviously starts to touch on some VAT exemption opportunities potentially.
Yeah, it's a minefield. It's an absolute minefield. I mean, theoretically, working on a home that's been empty for 2 years should qualify the contractor for a 5%. I don't know how well that works in practice, but there's also another, as if the VAT weren't enough. I'll leave the VAT question. The other thing that happens to communities is that if they purchase a property that's empty, then obviously it takes them a while to plan the works, and it'll take, there's another layer. We start to retrofit. They're still liable for council tax. And that, if the property's been empty for over 2 years, then that can be a penalty council tax. So we need to look at VAT. We also need to look at council tax when communities are planning works on empty homes, and when they're carrying out works on empty homes, because they're all just taxes on change.
That's super interesting. Naomi and Phillipa, before I move on to any other questions, do you have anything you might want to add on that?
Just on, exploring funding opportunities and how social housing providers can take advantage of those is the SHDF social housing fund that's the new wave's just been announced, which is great. There are quite a lot of boxes that need to be ticked by housing providers, so it makes it quite difficult to identify the right buildings at the right time with the right tenant. So there's a few hurdles to get through, and you have to be really on the ball to be able to take advantage of it. So I think that's one of the difficulties, is that these funding streams kind of come and go, and you have to be really quick to learn the rules.
Brilliant, thank you. No, I'm sure, again, lots more that we could discuss on policies and incentives, but I'll move on to some of the other questions we've had come through into the chat. One is, well, I'm going to combine two into one because they both have similar themes. One's addressed to Phillipa and the other one to Naomi, really about marketing of the benefits of retrofitting. So the first one was to Naomi, how do you plan to address potential resistance from homeowners that may be reluctant to make changes to their homes? Are there communication or educational strategies in place to help homeowners understand the benefits of retrofitting? And I'm going to just combine another question which was posed to Phillipa. Residential retrofit has a big challenge: how to market itself to homeowners and landlords in order to be achieved at scale. Have you had any thoughts on marketing communication strategies so this can happen? So I think, it makes sense in my mind to combine them both, but maybe I'll start off with Phillipa, maybe on that one.
Yeah, sure. It is a challenge, definitely, and I sort of touched on it in my presentation, that there's different incentives for landlords and for owners than there is for leaseholders. But in terms of marketing retrofit for the sort of able to pay sector, which is the sector that we work in, you know, who does the marketing? We kind of rely on the homeowner wanting to do these works off their own back. You know, the changes that Rishi's made, it's all to do with taking away the stick and sort of going more towards a carrot approach in terms of policy. So yeah, we're really reliant on homeowners recognizing off their own back, really, that there are works that could be undertaken now. Yes, it means reaching in your pocket, but over time you're going to reap the benefits financially, in terms of, you know, the enjoyment of their home, but also a sense of, you know, doing what's right for the environment and doing their part in achieving net zero. But I definitely think the government could do more. There's basically limited funding for landlords or the average homeowner. There's a lot of funding that's gone into social housing, which is great, and as I think someone said, a whole host more has just been announced, which it is great. But what limited funding there was for the average homeowner to carry out works has been pulled, basically. And yeah, it relies on homeowners having quite a substantial amount of upfront cash to make these changes. And with things the way that they are at the minute, people don't often have that cash, and if they do, they might not be willing to part with it because they're concerned about uncertainties, or you know, they might needing it later down the line for other things. So it's a really difficult one. I mean, the able to pay clients that come to us and that we work with, generally they have a sense of responsibility a lot of the time, which is really nice. They care about their emissions. They want to be more green, but also they want their bills to come down, and they want to, you know, get rid of condensation problems or whatever it is that's affecting them. But in terms of marketing retrofit works to that able to pay sector or to the average homeowner, I don't know who would market it other than the manufacturers who make the materials, potentially. I think that there would ideally be some funding incentives in place, but I don't run the country, so.
And Naomi, from your perspective, again, like communication, educational strategies, I mean, it seemed like a lot of the graphical approaches that you had presented seemed to have a kind of WYSIWYG approach. They kind of really understand immediacy, but I just wonder if you might speak to that a bit.
Yeah, thanks. So we've done a lot of guides sort of aimed at different groups. We've done some guides aimed at conservation officers, at residents, sort of on behalf of local authorities or housing associations. And yeah, I think when you look for advice on retrofit online, it's very disparate. It's really hard to get all the information you need in one place. I've got a lot of hope about the National Retrofit Hub, which is just being started, and it's aiming to kind of help drive a national strategy for retrofit. And there's going to be a knowledge hub which draws together all the disparate bits of information on the internet. So I think that will be really helpful in terms of just clarifying the basics and stopping people from getting overwhelmed and just knowing what to do first. The other thing, an obvious thing to do would be to contact a retrofit coordinator and look at the past 2035 process, because that sort of helps get the process underway and helps limit risk of retrofit as well. I think that's really important for householders.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've started to notice myself in homeowner clients being more au fait with the term retrofit. In fact, when I picked up my kids from school yesterday, another parent asked me about retrofitting a Victorian house. I've never really kind of seen that in a kind of more non-construction industry a person kind of context. So no, certainly there's a groundswell of kind of momentum building there. Thank you. I've got muted myself. I've got a question for Bridget here, which I think is a really interesting one. Quite simply put, but what was the most unexpected outcome of the Retrofit Empty Homes project? Well, you're still on mute.
Yeah, there were many. There were many. It was such a roller coaster of a project. I think from our point of view, the most unexpected outcome was the extent to which we worked with non-housing people. So as I mentioned earlier, the route in for this was climate change, both at the strategic, political, community, every level. It was a climate change entry point, which I suppose looking back, we should perhaps have expected, but being housing people, it was a bit of a surprise that there would be so much. It's like we discovered a whole new resource, a whole new people knowledge resource that we didn't know was there in the environmental side of that. And I think one of the really nice outcomes of it was that we were able to make those sort of ground those conversations that were going on about retrofit, climate change. It's all kind of up there and it's big and it's enormous. And we were able to just draw that down to the community and start to talk about it and have conversations where people said, I don't know, but we can find out. Nobody had to be an expert. And I think that for us was quite an empowering outcome, both for ourselves, but also for the communities that we were working with and the other professionals that we were working with. You don't always have to know.
No, really great to hear. Yeah, no, super inspiring, especially to see some of the kind of skilling opportunities that you're creating for local too. I've got a question now for Phillipa, some which are praising your surveying firm, so lots of positives there. But one in particular is really commending the fact that you've got a specialist retrofit aspect in the practice. And what do you think might be the best way to get more surveyors on board with retrofit advice? Is there a growing network of retrofit surveyors? And how might one help ensure that retrofit advice is being given robustly and safely? Lots there, but hopefully something to.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's a good question. In terms of surveying, getting more surveyors into retrofit, I think there is a shortage for sure. In fact, a couple of weeks back at the building centre, I attended one of the Wednesday evening talks on that issue precisely, just skill shortage throughout the whole industry when it comes to retrofit, surveyors included. But where sort of getting more surveyors interested is concerned, I would like to think that the RICS will have a dedicated retrofit pathway at some point in the future. They've just written their retrofit standard. It leans really, really heavily on PAS 2035, as it should. But I think now that they have that as a standard, perhaps that might go on to form the basis of a pathway. So anyone looking to undertake their APC and become chartered with the RICS, they can sort of choose designated pathways. I know myself, maybe I'm biased, but I would have 100% chosen a retrofit pathway if it was there, because it feels like something that you can get really passionate about and something that's really important and something that's gaining more and more importance as time goes on. So I would like to think that that's in their pipeline. What was the other half of that question? Sorry, Jonathan. Was there another half?
There were three mini questions in there. One I think which would be good to touch on is the kind of ability to provide maybe robust and rigorous retrofit advice. I think, the idea that it might come from a chartered surveyor, I think gives a lot of confidence. But I suppose what types of checks and measures are in place to ensure that it's provided robustly?
I think the retrofit works need to fall back on PAS 2035, which is the national standard. The old one, it's just been updated. I don't know if this still stands, but it has sort of different risk levels, and the higher risk level works, which are the sort of works that we would do, like high blocks of flats, or maybe looking at whole estates, or looking at undertaking 5 or more measures. You need to have a chartered surveyor or a qualified architect involved. So again, I think that's where, as a firm, we are really well suited, because since starting at EK Retrofit, we have registered coordinator and assessor under PAS, but obviously we also have that chartered surveyor side of it as well, so we can offer quite a lot in-house. Feedback I hear on PAS is that there's a lot of roles which can get a little bit convoluted and a little bit off-putting to the general sort of consumer. So yeah, for us, EK Retrofit being able to offer PAS compliant, Trustmark approved, registered coordinators and assessor services, and RICS chartered surveying services as well, we'd like to think that is a very sort of robust and all belts and braces service, if I do say so myself.
No, it does sound like it is. We're close to running out of time, and we've got lots of questions left. I've got one more question, which I think it's been showing that it's been answered, but I don't think it has, and I think it's a really important one. It's for Naomi, and I think maybe we'll just have this as the last one. It was about, I'll just kind of maybe abridge it. How do you account for potential changes in building standards and technology that might affect the effectiveness of the chosen retrofit archetypes over time? And what plans are there to periodically review and adjust those archetypes? I think it'd be really important to hear on that, actually.
Yeah, great question. So the archetype can be thought of as a template for a plan for those for a group of buildings. So when you look at an individual building, you can draw on the information from that retrofit template, but then look at the specifics, and you can update the knowledge and make it most relevant to that time and the people that it's affecting, and any changes to the building that have happened since the archetypes developed. So it's supposed to be this sort of iterative process where the archetypes are learning from the experience on site. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. No, I really want to touch on that, because I think there's a lot of power to kind of how that model is constantly updated and renewed and refreshed. Thank you. We have, I think, run out of time. There's loads and loads of other questions that I think have been raised. I'm not sure what functionality there is for those questions to be answered by the panelists, but thank you all for your support with those questions there. I really wanted to just say thank you, if I can, to the speakers, to Naomi, Bridget and Phillipa. I found that super interesting, and thank you for everyone for joining online. I'm going to hand over to Laura, who's got some final words for us, but it's been a pleasure to have been invited to chair this event today. Thank you.
Great, and thank you, Jonathan, for you and your chairing role. I appreciate doing the webinar format. Makes it a bit tricky for the Q&A stage, but I think you all did fantastically, and I am sure our attendees really appreciated hearing what you had to say individually and then collectively. So thank you collectively to you all, speakers and chair. The event has been recorded, and we will try and get it up on the Building Centre's website and YouTube channel as soon as possible. So if you have enjoyed the session, feel free to share it on your networks with your friends, colleagues who maybe couldn't make it this evening. And we have our final Retrofit Meets event next Wednesday evening. That one will be in person in the Building Centre. There's no strikes planned that day. So if you can join us for that, that will be another 6 o'clock start through to 7:30 in the Building Centre on the topic of district heating. And as it's our final event, there will be some drinks served, kindly provided through our event sponsor Rahal for that one. So yeah, you can book via our Eventbrite in the usual format. So yeah, thanks again for attendees, speakers, Jonathan as chair. It's been a lovely evening, a lovely session. But yeah, time to go home now, or if you are at home, time to get your tea. And we'll see you all again soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Bye.
Bye.